Nelson Rockefeller is remembered by the American people as a visionary, a New York State governor, the 41st Vice President of the United States, a devoted father, and by many, a racist. Tragically, Rockefeller's infamous drug legislation in the state of New York created racial and ethnic disparity within the criminal justice system and attempted to solve the state's drug addiction problem with punitive punishment for addicts and dealers. However, as a result of his attempt to triumph over drug addiction in the state, countless members of society were imprisoned for 15 years to life for first-time, low-level, non-violent offenses. The Rockefeller drug laws created a shift toward addressing drug use and abuse through the criminal justice system rather than through the public health systems. The draconian Rockefeller drug laws became an inspiration for the war on drug policies that were enacted throughout the nation. Nelson Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1908, into the renowned Rockefeller family. He entered the political arena after a brief stint in the business sector, and his early policies earned him notoriety among well-respected liberal Republicans in power. In 1959, Rockefeller was elected the governor of New York and served in this position for 14 years. Prior to 1973, Rockefeller's liberal policies defined drug addiction as an illness rather than a crime. He created numerous treatment programs for drug addicts, positioning the addict as the victim and the dealer as the true offender. Rockefeller signed the Metcalfe-Volcker Act in 1962 and created the Narcotic Addiction Control Commission in 1967, which allowed addicts to choose between lengthy treatment programs instead of incarceration.
I have one goal, one objective, and that is to stop the pushing of drugs and to protect the innocent victim. I was on this kick of trying to get the addict off the street into treatment, and on the theory that if we got them all off the street into treatment, there'd be nobody to buy the drugs and therefore the pushers would go away. Now, this was a beautiful concept, except it just didn't happen to relate to the realities because the pushers keep finding new people. And number two, that those who are addicted are not crazy about going into treatment.
In 1972, the heroin crisis in New York prompted Rockefeller to investigate the extremely low rate of drug addiction in Japan. Rockefeller fixated on one aspect of Japan's drug policies: automatic life sentences for drug dealers. Rockefeller decided to act, and in 1972, he announced,
"Let's tell it like it is. We have achieved very little permanent rehabilitation."
Rockefeller's staff was hesitant to support these policies because it removed a judge's discretion when determining sentence lengths for those who were convicted. However, Rockefeller revealed his plans to the public during his State of the State speech in January 1973. The Rockefeller drug laws mandated that anyone in possession of 4 or more ounces of narcotics be sentenced to 15 years to life in a New York State prison for first-time, low-level, non-violent offenses. This was the same punishment for second-degree murder. Judges were now required to send addicts to prison rather than treatment programs. Politicians have since argued that Rockefeller enacted the drug laws to appeal to the conservative Republicans in order to gain their support if he were to run for president. Howard Jones, former head of the Narcotics Addiction Control Commission, criticized Rockefeller's policy, stating that jails would not have space for all of the convicts, juries would hesitate to convict, it minimized the power of the judge, the budget could not afford this policy, and it offered no second chance to offenders. The logic behind Rockefeller's drug laws was that if drug dealers were sentenced to life in prison, fewer people would deal drugs. But the harsh new laws marked a new direction in the development of the modern war on drugs, influencing other states to use mandatory minimum sentences and redirect their state's anti-addiction resources from treatment to law enforcement and punishment.
So there's the sociological aspect to it that inevitably falls harder on the poorer strata of society more often than not on people of color.
In 1974, Rockefeller became the vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford. However, his drug laws continued to impact New Yorkers and promoted racial discrimination in societal assumptions as well as sentencing patterns. The drug laws targeted Hispanic and African American communities and violated a multitude of constitutional rights, such as the right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures.
The system of mass incarceration was born of racial opportunism. It was born of a desire by politicians to exploit our nation's racial divisions and anxieties for political gain. When politicians began, rallying around the Get Tough bandwagon, it was an effort to appeal to the racial anxieties, stereotypes, and resentments of poor and working class whites.
The Rockefeller drug laws were a desperate attempt to triumph over the drug crisis of the 1970s, but the tragic impact was the criminalization of drug addiction, the failure to provide second chances for those convicted, overpopulation in New York State prisons, and racial and ethnic disparity in the state's prisons. Anthony Papa was convicted in 1984 for delivering 4.5 ounces of cocaine and was sentenced to 15 years to life under the Rockefeller drug laws despite his status as a nonviolent first-time offender.
And was to capture the drug kingpin and curb the drug epidemic. It didn't either. It incarcerated low-level nonviolent offenders, many, like I said, black and Latino, and it was a total disaster. It wound up breaking the New York State system because it exploded at its seams with people that were incarcerated for low-level crimes.
By 1992 in New York State, 94% of those committed for drug offenses were black or Latino. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, higher arrest and incarceration rates for those communities are not reflective of increased prevalence of drug use, but rather of law enforcement's focus on urban areas, lower-income communities, and communities of color. Selective arrest and prosecution, inadequate legal representation, and the absence of judicial discretion in the sentencing process are the causes of these disparities. New York State has one of the highest levels of racial disparities anywhere in the nation. By 2000, the demographics of imprisoned drug offenders had not changed. Organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union and the Justice Policy Institute raised awareness about the inherent racial disparities caused by the Rockefeller drug laws, which led to the reform of the laws in 2004 and 2005. These reforms included reduced sentences and the reform of harsh parole procedures. In 2009, Governor David Paterson further reformed the Rockefeller drug laws. Paterson's reforms restored judicial discretion and provided funds for community-based alternatives to incarceration.
A point of shame today that it's going to take a long time to overcome. Yeah, it stigmatized even further the unfortunate lot of people of color, and it was deadly. It was terrible.
Rockefeller's attempt to triumph over the drug crisis had tragic consequences, which remain present in society today. The Rockefeller drug laws led to the mass criminalization of people of color and a system of racial segregation often compared to the Jim Crow era. The drug laws played a critical role in shaping aggressive law enforcement strategies that overwhelmingly targeted black and Latino people.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Today, there are a number of organizations as well as movements that have addressed racial and ethnic disparity in the criminal justice system as a result of Rockefeller's infamous drug laws. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement has publicized racial disparity in the criminal justice system and police brutality targeting African Americans. Minority populations are still being targeted, and action must be taken to further reform the Rockefeller drug laws in order to resolve the pressing issues paralyzing the criminal justice system.
And statistics being what they are, they show that there is a disproportionate number of people who are either involved in the criminal justice system through arrest or supervision after arrest, who happen to be people of color. And I think the statistics alone are alarming.
The most tragic effect of the Rockefeller drug laws has been the institutional racism these laws perpetuate, which is still prominent in American society. Black and Latino people who have been incarcerated under the Rockefeller drug laws for nonviolent, first-time offenses remain marginalized and disenfranchised. They have been trapped by the criminal justice system that brands them as felons and thereby legalizes the denial of basic rights and opportunities, which relegates them to second-class status. They are stripped of the rights they won in the civil rights movement. Many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind during the Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again.